1652. Maritime trade is of utmost importance to European powers. Their ships are everywhere in the ocean. The English decide that they are the lords of the sea, and so they demand that other ships from other countries strike their flags, that is, lower them, as a salute when they come across them in the waters. One Dutch captain is a little bit slow to do this, and the English are offended. How dare you? A battle ensues, and then just over a month later, war is declared. The war lasts for 2 years. The nation's funds are depleted, and they start taxing the landowners in order to fund their war. Enter William Petty. He's a physician, an economist, and maybe more importantly, he's a landowner as well. So he says, landowners are paying too much tax. And in order to prove this, he actually develops the first form of the gross domestic product, otherwise known as GDP. Fast forward a few hundred years later, and we are now in 1933, the midst of the Great Depression. The US Congress is trying to figure their way through this, and they hire this man, Simon Kuznets. Simon Kuznets develops the modern form of the gross domestic product. 10 years later, 1944, a lot has happened. We are now at the end of the Second World War. 44 nations meet in the US in a place called Bretton Woods. You might be familiar with this name. They're looking for financial stability. And one of the decisions they make in order to pursue this financial stability is for gross domestic product, or GDP, to become the universal measure of economic success. That brings us to today, 2024. You've all heard of GDP, right? It's known and used worldwide as a measure of economic success. The problem, however, is that when I look up how successful Malaysia is, it actually gives us our GDP. Now, this is a problem because GDP is only a measure of the economy. It only tells us the value of the goods and services produced in the country in 1 year. It doesn't really tell us much more than that. But here we are saying that the success of a country, not just the economy, but the country itself, can be measured by our GDP. However, GDP doesn't tell us anything about child mortality. It doesn't tell us anything about our average life expectancy, or how happy or healthy we are in that life. It doesn't tell us how many women are empowered, or how many of us are victims of crime. In fact, GDP is an economic measure, but it doesn't even tell us how many of us can afford a decent standard of living. Now, let's go back to Simon Kuznets, because actually what he said is the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. And this is the guy who developed our modern GDP. So why are we using GDP to measure the success of a country? Okay, now I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I'm an economist. And as an economist, I should tell you that actually GDP is related to well-being. So GDP measures the value of the goods and services that are produced in a country every year, right? So the more goods and services there are, the more there is for people to consume. And at least at the lower end of development, consumption and well-being are related. So the more you can consume, the better off you are. And so as GDP rises, individual incomes tend to rise, and as individual incomes tend to rise, people are able to afford more, and so they can afford to consume more. And so you see a lot of actually great things happen when GDP rises. So you see, for example, longer lifespans, higher education rates, etc. But it's really not much more than that, actually, to be honest. These are things that are likely to happen, but they're not guaranteed to happen. You need to have good enough policies for these good outcomes to come when GDP rises. So an interesting example of this is actually in very recent years, 2019 to 2021. So you guys might recognize that that's when the global pandemic happened. And global life expectancy actually fell by 2 years. What do you think happened to the GDP? Did it also fall? No, it grew by over 10%. This is not a very good indicator of what can happen to life expectancy. Okay, so another thing that GDP is not very good at is telling us anything about sustainability or equality in our country. This is meant to be good for GDP. And this can be considered good for GDP because more goods are being produced, but all that money is going to probably one conglomerate. And meanwhile, there are communities in that area that may have just lost their livelihoods. And downstream, there's another community who will get flooded. And what about next year? Do you think the company is able to come back and do this again in this same area next year? No, next year they have to go to another patch, and the year after that, another patch. And well, what happens when we run out of patches? This is not a sustainable way to grow an economy, but GDP doesn't care about that. An economy that focuses on annual GDP growth doesn't care about the benefit of future generations. Now, we can see this in the world around us today. When I was in school, and this was, some might say not so long ago, and some of you might say very long ago, and that was in the 1990s, we learned about climate change in the 1990s, and back then we were talking about how to stop climate change. Today it's 2024, and we're still talking about how to stop climate change. And not only are we talking about how to stop climate change, unfortunately today, we're also talking about how to live with it and how to adapt to it. So the real problem with using GDP as a measure of as a measure of progress or success is that a lot of the times we forget that it's only meant to be a proxy indicator for all the good things it's supposed to bring about. And instead we focus on just increasing GDP. And when we do that, sometimes we step over all the good things it's supposed to bring about. Now there's a really interesting case study from Mongolia. In 2019, Mongolia submitted a report to a United Nations Forum on Sustainable Development. And what they said was that, GDP has grown by quite a lot in some years and not very much in others. And what they found was that the benefits of economic growth have not translated into better livelihood options, and employment opportunities have not expanded. So even in years of high economic growth, unemployment did not drop significantly, and they in fact saw inequality deepening. They saw rises in crime and violence and environmental pollution. In particular, they highlighted the fact that air pollution was becoming a real problem in the country. The capital of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, was seeing pollutants that were at levels that were 25 times higher than the World Health Organization's requirements. Now, air pollution is a problem, of course, because it impacts the environment and it impacts health. And when it impacts health, it's also going to impact things like productivity and education as well, and these were reflected in a report. So the report basically said that the development pathway that Mongolia was on was causing these issues, but more importantly, it laid out a whole society approach in order to address them. So essentially, Mongolia has recognized that a focus solely on GDP growth has been unconstructive. And I think it's actually really great that this country has come out onto the world stage and said, hey, we did what you said. We've grown our GDP, but actually it's made things kind of bad. So essentially, I guess GDP as a measure of progress or success, meh. So, okay, what are the alternatives? The good news is that there's this thing called beyond GDP, and this concept is the idea that we should be looking at and aiming towards additional and different indicators for development. So imagine a world where we make decisions based on our own values. These values can be things like health, a community, or sustainability. So when we think of building infrastructure, we don't just look at return on investment. We can look at the impacts to health as well and the impacts to environment. And this can influence things like, where and how we build our housing, what kind of power we choose to use, and also the type of transport systems we use. It also impacts how we look at work and productivity and who we value in the society. So somebody like an unpaid carer, we recognize and we support them. And we respect the work that janitors do as much as we respect the work that doctors do, because they are both as vital as each other. Our policies make us happier, they'll make us healthier, they'll make us more connected and more educated. That sounds great, right? So actually, it's no wonder that this idea of beyond GDP has been promoted in many initiatives, including at the United Nations. And we even had Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the United Nations, underline the importance of going beyond GDP. So this idea is not new, and it's been gaining in popularity over the years. In 1972, Bhutan actually developed something called the Gross National Happiness Index, and you guys might have heard of this. And their king at the time in 1972 said that this Gross National Happiness Index is more important than the gross domestic product. And in 2008, they made that the goal of their government. In 2011, New Zealand Treasury, which is like our Ministry of Finance, started talking to consultants and experts and communities to try and find out what is important to New Zealanders. So they've come up with a living standards framework. This framework is being refined every single year, and it now is used in New Zealand's decisions on how they spend their national budget. And just at the end of 2022, New Zealand was joined by Scotland, Wales, Finland, Iceland, and Canada to form the Wellbeing Economy Governance Partnership. So what about us? Have you guys ever heard of the Malaysian Wellbeing Index? Have you heard of the Malaysia Happiness Index? No. Well, the thing is, they do exist. They do, and we do refer to them in our 5-year plan. You might have heard of the Malaysia plans. We do refer to them. But we've not heard of them, right? Nobody, I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads around the room. And that's because we always refer to GDP when we talk about the success of Malaysia. Well, the good news is that they do exist. And the even better news is that the government is now introducing beyond GDP as a strategy to achieve our sustainable development goals. So we will hear about more of this in the future. And you sitting here in the room might actually also be helping to develop this framework, maybe as a community consultation or even as an expert. So in preparation for all this, I leave you with a question. And that question is, What do you value for us as a nation? What would you say to the government on what our goal for development should be? What makes us successful in your eyes? Thank you.